Kesubos Daf begins with a Mishnah and contains one additional Mishnah. The topic of both Mishnayos is which type of woman gets a ksuba of 100 zuz, which type of woman gets a ksuba of 200 zuz, and which gets none. The first Mishnah is focused on that of a woman who is suspected of not being a Bisula. The second one talks about a Mukas Eitz, a woman who has lost her Psulim without a Bia due to some other incident. So let's begin. The first Mishnah discusses a type of woman who is usually in a situation where there is a Bia, but it happened before she was 3 years old. The Gemara will talk about halachas of the Gerus of a katan, bring two halachas of conversion of a minor, and bring a kasha from our Mishnah and a proof from our Mishnah as far as those halachas. So let's begin. Generally, the assumption is, says the Mishnah, that a giores, a shivuya, that is a woman who is held captive, and a shivcha, that is a maidservant, they all are considered to be hefker to bia at some point in their previous lives, and therefore they're considered to be a ba'ula. There would not be considered to be someone who is a b'sula. However, if they left that state while they were under 3 years old, any bia that they had doesn't count, because bia under 3 is restorable. The b'sulim grow back. So if a gioris converted, or if a shvuya was freed, or if a shivcha was redeemed, under 3 years old, they are considered to be basulim, and therefore they get a ksuba of 200. Similarly, anybody who marries them is under the assumption that they are psula. If it turns out that they're not a psula, they lose their ksuba completely because it is a mistaken marriage under false pretenses. All right, now the Gemara is going to bring two halachos about conversion. So the Gemara first says, Rav Huna says a halacha that you can convert a ger katan. You can convert a child. The Beis Din can convert him, even though if there are no parents around, the Beis Din can convert him, even though he does not have the das to agree. It's called a zechus. It's for his benefit to be converted. It's a good thing for him. And zachan la'adam without his own agreement. So you would do a tvila in the mikvah, do a meal if he's a boy, and then you can complete the conversion. Says the Gemara, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is that it's a schus for a person to convert. We learned that already. We said zachan la'adam shaloi b'fanav, chavan sh'adam ein chavan la'adam shaloi. We already learned you're allowed to do a schus for someone when he's not aware. You're not allowed to do something which is detrimental to him when he is not aware. So says, no, the chiddush is that it's considered to be a schus for a akum to convert. We know that for an eved, it's not considered to be a schus. They would rather be available to marry shfachos than be available to marry benos Yisrael. Now, for an akum, so how does it apply to him? So we may think, prefers a life of Isser, a life where he's available to do the forbidden things that are forbidden to Klal Yisrael. He prefers that, so he doesn't want to be converted. So the Gemara says, what it's coming to teach me is that's only true for a gadol, an adult who has already experienced those forbidden things. It's difficult for him to be told, no, now it's forbidden for you. You can't assume that he's going to agree to that. However, a child who never had those experiences, for sure it's better to not have them and never be involved in them, and therefore you can convert a child is 100% is zechus. Now, the Gemara says, let's bring a proof that this is true, that the Rav Huna's halacha, that you can convert a child. The Beis Din can convert a child. Let's prove that that's true from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah talks about a convert who converted less than 3 years old. So you see, there is a concept of converting a child. Gemara says it's not necessarily a proof. Rav Huna was talking about the Beis Din converting him and saying that that's a zechus. Our Mishnah was possibly talking about where the parents converted, that is, the parents converted themselves and converted their entire family along with them. That's for sure a zechus. There's no question that that's a zechus, because it's a zechus for a child to be in the same status as his parents. But that the Beis Din can convert them, and it's just a zechus in and of itself to be a Yisrael as opposed to being an Akum, that you don't see from our Mishnah. Another Gemara brings another halacha, which will attack from our Mishnah, as well as one other source. Rav Yosef says, when a child who converted as a katan grows up, he can opt out. He can say, I don't want this conversion. I prefer to go back to my state of being an akum. And then he returns, he's an akum again. While he is a child converted, he's no halach of an akum. If he touches wine, doesn't become yain nesach, no problem like that. He gets all the privileges of a Yisrael. If he opts out, he goes back to being an akum with all those halachos fully. If he's mekadesh in isha Yisraelis, it doesn't work, and all the halachos that follow. So Abaye and Rava both ask a kasha. Abaye asks from our Mishnah, Rava asks from a different case, and the Gemara has the same back and forth in answering them. Abaye's kasha is, why does the Mishnah say that they get a ksuba? Why would you give a ksuba to a woman who's potentially going to revert to being an akum? Then you're granting ksuba to someone who's going to use it for akum things. We don't do that. Rava's kasha was from a knas. If she is nisanes or she's mefuta, she is paid a knas by the man who violated her. Why would we do that? If she can opt out, she can end up taking the knas money and go using it for something else. Use it in her akum life. So why would we grant her knas money to be able to use it as an akum? Now, the kasha from Rava is based on a brisa that says this. It says these are the naras, these are the young women that have knas. That is a mamzeres, a nesina, a kusis, a giores, a shivuya, a shefcha, all of them, if they were freed or redeemed or whatever it is that happened to them less than 3 years old and they're psula, they get knas. So you see that in there is on the list here you had a giores who was converted at less than 3 years old, and she gets knas. So again, the kasha is, why would you give knas if she could opt out and go back to being an akum? So the Gemara answers, for both of them, it's not a kasha. You don't give her the knas, and in our Mishnah, you don't give her the ksuba until they are an adult and they stay opted in. So it says, but what do you mean? They could still opt out at some point in the future, and then you'll end up paying the money that'll be used in their status as an akum. So the Gemara says no. If they want to opt out, they have to opt out right away. It's got to be when they become bas mitzvah or bar mitzvah, they have to opt out right at that time. Once they've grown past that, they can no longer opt out. The window is closed. Now the Gemara is interested to know, why does Abaye ask from our Mishnah from the ksuba and Rava asks from knas? Why don't they each ask from the other's case? So the Gemara said Abaye didn't want to ask from knas because he understood there's a point in knas. Knas is a deterrent to the violator. So we want the violator to be deterred even if the money is going to go to an akum. Rava didn't ask from ksuba because ksuba is meant for the woman to feel secure. So we don't want him easy. We don't want it to be easy for the man to divorce her. It could be that we have a state like that and we want that to be true even if she may still opt out and become an akum. All right, now we go to our next Mishnah, which introduces the topic of mukas eitz. It begins by discussing other types of bia which are not a bia halachically. In order for a bia to be a halachic bia, it's got to be a girl over 3 years old and a boy over 9 years old. Either one under that doesn't count as a bia. The Gemara will discuss what does it count as, and what does a mukas eitz count as, and what is the status of a mukas eitz as far as how much ksuba she gets, and are we talking about where the guy knew she was a mukas eitz or not? So let's just define the concept of mukas eitz. Mukas eitz means that her basulim were ruptured not by a bia, not by a human interaction, but by some object. Could be that she fell and she was struck by a branch in that area and her basulim tore, or whatever the situation is, anything which is not a bia that ruptures the basulim. So the Gemara talks about the Mishnah that is begins and it talks about 3 cases. It talks about a adult man who has bia with a kitana that's under 3 years old, an adult woman that has bia with a katan that's under 9 years old. Both of these don't count as a bia. And then it talks about a mukas eitz. So it says, what is their halacha? So it's a machlokes. Rabbi Meir says all 3 get a regular ksuba of 200 zuz. They are all 3 considered to be a besula. They're entitled to the full ksuba. The Chachamim say a mukas eitz is not entitled to the full ksuba. She only gets a ksuba of 100 zuz, like an almana, like a be'ula. Okay, now the Mishnah moves on and it discusses a almana, a woman who was married but is still a psula. She was married but she became an almana, a divorcee, a grusha, or a chalutza. from marriage after chuppah, but she's still a basula. So what's her halacha there? Does she on the one hand she's a basula, on the other hand she was married fully? So the Gemara says she's assumed to be a be'ula. She has the same halacha as a be'ula. She does not get a ksuba of 200. She only gets a ksuba of 100. And there's no claim against her. If she's found to not be a basula, she doesn't lose that 100. Now, a giores, a captive, or a shivcha that were redeemed over 3 years old, they are not assumed to be psulim. They only get a ksuba of 100, and there is no taina of she was not found to be a basula. Okay, the Gemara begins by introducing halacha, which the Gemara will just say doesn't fit in our Mishnah. So that halacha is, what is the exact status of a bias katan under 9 years old and a bias ketana under 3 years old? We said it doesn't count as a bia. Does it count as anything? So the Gemara quotes Rav Yehuda, who brings a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. He says that Rav says it does count as something. It counts as a mukas eitz. Mukas eitz is not nothing. Mukas eitz is not a basula in all its halachos, and not a ba'ula in all the halachos. It's not a basula because she's not allowed to marry a kohen hagadol. It also has a machlokes as to whether she gets a ksuba or not. According to Rabbi Meir, she gets a full ksuba. According to Chacham, she only gets 100. So a mukas eitz doesn't count as a regular bula, doesn't count as a regular psula. She's in kind of intermediary stage. What's the halacha of a bias katan or a specifically bias katan? That is, the woman was a gedola, and she had bia from a katan under 9 years old. What does that count as? So Rav says it counts as a mukas eitz. She would only get a ksuba of 100, according to the Chachamim, and she is also to marry a kohen hagadol. Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel says mukas eitz cannot be something that is formed by human flesh. It has to be a foreign object, and therefore she doesn't count as anything. She does not count as she had any bia at all. She is a complete basula. She can marry a kohen gadol, and she is no machlokes as to whether or not she gets her full ksuba of 200. Even the Chachamim agree that she gets a ksuba of 200. So the Gemara obviously is going to ask from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had the case of the bias kitana, the bias katan, and the mukas eitz, where Meir said all get a ksuba of 200, and the Chachamim only argued about the mukas eitz. That shows that they agree that a bias katan gets a ksuba of 200. That means that there's no machlokes. It means that she's not a mukas eitz. That's a clear kasha on Rav, who says that she has the status of a mukas eitz, and the Chachamim would argue there as well. So the Gemara says you have to reread the Mishnah a little bit. The 3 cases are meant to be set up as follows. First, it says that a bias ketana is nothing. That everybody agrees to. Then it says a bias katan counts as a mukas eitz, and a mukas eitz is a machlokes between Rav Yehuda and the Chachamim if she gets a ksuba of 200 or a ksuba of 100 zuz. But really, according to Rav, will say that there's a machlokes in both those cases as well. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to talk about what are we talking about here in this machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, whether she gets a ksuba of 100 or 200. Are we talking about an issue of mekachtos? Or are we talking about where there's no issue of mekachtos? Is there a claim that he didn't know? So are we referring to the general halacha of mukas eitz? Does she count as a psula? Does she count as a ba'ula? Does she get a ksuba of 200? Does she get a ksuba of 100? But we're leaving out the entire topic of mekachtos. We're talking about where the guy knew that she's a mukas eitz. The question is this considered to be a psula or a ba'ula? If, however, the guy didn't know she was a mukas eitz, then quite possibly she would get nothing, not 200, not 100. So the Gemara first quotes Rami Bar Chama, who says, yes, everyone would agree that it's a mekachtos if she does not, if she turns out to be a mukas eitz, and the husband thought that she was not a mukas eitz at all. He thought that she was she had full basulim. So there, everyone agrees she gets nothing. Machlokes is only, what does she get if he knows she counts as a psula, she counts as a ba'ula? Because she's in between. On the one hand, she did not have a human maisa, she did not have a bi'iyah with a person. On the other hand, she had something, not the same as if she has nothing. So the halacha that they're arguing about is, how does she compare to a bogeres? A bogeres is an older woman, she's older age, she's above age 12 and a half, who loses her besulim just due to age. So this mukas eitz also lost her besulim. But a bogeres had no maisa, nothing happened. Ba'ula, though, had a human Maisa. This is in between. She had a Maisa, she had an action that made her lose her psulim, but not a human action. Does that count? Where does that fit? So, Rav Yehuda says she's just like a Bogeres, and just like a Bogeres, still, she didn't have a human action. Just like a Bogeres is still entitled to a ksuba of 200, she's also entitled to a ksuba of 200. The Chachamim disagree. They say, no, she had something. She's different than a Bogeres. Bogeres gets a ksuba of 200 because she had no Maisa at all. Here, she had a Maisa, and therefore she is not entitled to full ksuba. She only gets a ksuba of 100. All right, now the Gemara says we have a kasha on this because according to this, everybody agrees that if he didn't know, she would lose her ksuba. It's a makachtes. The problem is that we have a case where a woman was found to be not a psula, and her husband came to court and said she wasn't a psula, and the woman claimed I was a mukas eitz, and Rav Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer paskin she's believed, and therefore she gets a ksuba. And here the guy definitely didn't know she was a mukas eitz. So you can tell me everybody agrees that a mukas eitz is grounds for mekachtos to say that this was a marriage of false pretenses. Was it help her that she defends herself that she was a mukas eitz? So what? She still doesn't get a ksuba. So it's a kasha. So the Gemara therefore brings Rava's opinion, and Rava says we're going to have to redo this. Rava says no. Both questions are machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. The question of whether a known mukas eitz gets 100 or 200 is one machlokes. Another machlokes is, does she lose her ksuba further if it was false pretenses, if he didn't know? Rabbi Yehuda doesn't make a difference if he knows. Mukas eitz gets 200 across the board, whether he knew, he didn't know. Mukas eitz is 200. According to the Chacham and Mukas eitz, his best case scenario is 100, and that's if he knew. And if it was under false pretenses, she loses it and she gets 0. So now the Gemara says, but Rava actually backed off this psak, and you can see this from a comment that he had on a completely different sugya in a different scenario where we had a kasha from a brisa, a whole back and forth, and Rava commented that, and based on his comment there, we see he backed off and he held that a mukas eitz really does get 100 according to the Chachamim. It's not considered to be a full mekachtos that she gets nothing. What's that case? What's that sugya? So the Gemara introduces it. It's a brisa that discusses what is the procedure of a man claiming against his wife that she was not a psula. So it says he comes to court and he says to the girl's father, I did not find psulim for your daughter, and then we look for witnesses. So if there's witnesses that she was mizana while she was married to him, she gets a ksuba of 100. Gemara interrupts, what? That can't be right. If there was witnesses that she was mizana while she was married to him, she gets skila. The Gemara says, yeah, okay, so for that she gets skila, but if there's witnesses that she was mizana before she was married, she gets a ksuba of 100. So the Gemara says, as Rav Chibar Avin said, in the name of Rav Sheshes, that means that a woman who gets married under the assumption that she was a bisula, and it turns out that she was a bu'ula, like this case, where it turned out that she was mizana before she was married, she still gets a ksuba of 100. And the Gemara has a kasha on that. How could that be that she still gets a ksuba of 100? Rav Nachman asked, we have a brisa that says, somebody marries a woman and it finds that she's not a psula. She says, it happened, I was nisanes, I was raped after we were already engaged, and therefore it's your mazel. You already took me in, and it's your property that was damaged. Therefore, I don't lose. And he says, no, whatever happened before we were engaged, and therefore it's false pretenses completely, and you don't get. So it's a. It is considered to be a complete mekach tais, and I don't owe you anything. So according to his claim, he's saying it happened before we were married, you get nothing. The Gemara points out that you get nothing. That's what he's trying to say. So that would mean that the legal claim is that if she really lost her psulim before they were married, she should get nothing. So how could you say here that no, she gets 100? So the Gemara then says, Rav Chibar Avin said, Rav Amram and all Gedele Hadar stat, and they heard of Shesha say this halacha, you get 100, and they asked and they answered that when he said that it was a mekach tois, doesn't mean that's a mekach tois and you get nothing. Mekach tois means you get 100. So how could you sit here and say no, mekach tois means you get nothing? It's not true. Mekach tois means you get 100. Now, Rava commented on that, and Rava said, no, mekach means you get nothing. The phrase mekach means it's a mistake. Mekach doesn't mean I married you under false pretenses, therefore you go down from 200 to 100. False pretenses means I wouldn't have married you. I didn't want to marry you in the first place if I would have known what the situation is. Therefore you get 0. So then we have a kasha according to Rava. The Mishnah says that she gets 100, and in that claim there she gets 0. So how do you explain that? So the Gemara says that Rava answered, and Rava says it's talking about mukas eitz. It said that if she was was Nisanes or Mizana before she was married, she gets 0. If she was Mukas 8, then she gets 100. That's what you have to stick in there. So you see here clearly that Rava says that in the case of a Mukas 8, she does get a ksuba of 100, even though it was under false circumstances. He didn't know that, because it's not really completely false, it's just a Mukas 8. So Rava therefore has to be holding that the Chachamim would agree that where he didn't know, she still gets awarded a ksuba of 100. Rabbi Meir, we know, says 200, and Rava had said here that the Chachamim say 0. So Rava has to have changed his mind based on this and said that he agrees that she gets at least a ksuba of 100.